Welcome to another edition of Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. Today's guest is Orianna Nienan. She is an intuitive who provides vibrational tuning and other services for people in the process of awakening and expanding their consciousness. Orianna, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Johnny.
Good to have you here. So, awakening, ascension, very hot topic these days. What do you think awakening is?
Yeah, so I think awakening is really starting to understand the truth of who we are. I think that we've forgotten large parts of ourselves as humans and the capabilities that are inherent to being human. And I think we're in the process of remembering that. And I think ascension is a valid way to look at it because as we become more aware of the finer vibrations of our consciousness, this is a way of ascending. That's what ascension is really talking about. The level of awareness is raising.
So in other words, when people are talking about waking up and the ascension, they're pretty much talking about the same thing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Does it have to do with moving from, 3D to 4D to 5D? That D stands for dimension or density or both?
I think it could be both. It's used interchangeably in the community, and we're all sort of reaching for a common framework, a common understanding of what these words mean, right? And sometimes they mean different things to different people. I use 3D to mean dimension, but certainly I do think that we're shifting from 3D through 4D to 5D. And what is that? For me, 3D has a lot to do with how we source our energy. So in the third dimension, this is a place of cause and effect. We're really in a transactional model with other people and where we're having exchanges and trading energy and sometimes taking energy from one another. But we're also making deals and trading and such. As we move into the higher levels, we actually start to understand the infinite energy that's available to us. And we start to live in the fifth dimension from a place of unconditionality, where really we're sourcing from our own source instead of other people.
I think the transactional part of that is very interesting. I used to live in Los Angeles, and a friend of mine once told me that people come here to take something. They're not really giving anything. So when you say transactional, people give and take, and some people take more and some people give more. But as we go up the dimensional ladder, as it were, I think we abandon that and we source it from ourselves. Is that how it works?
Absolutely. And I think we begin to understand that we are infinite at the core. So this idea in the third dimension, we're still operating in this system of lack and thinking that we have to earn, we have to get something from outside ourselves. So many sages talk about this, right? Just going outside of ourselves to get things causes pain and suffering, right? So as we ascend, we understand the true source, and that true source is within us. And we start to live from that.
Trying to understand it is one thing. Teaching it is probably a completely different ballgame, which we'll get into. You offer what you call vibrational tuning. I imagine that probably has to do with frequencies and levels of some sort. Tell us a little bit more about how that works and how people come to understand it.
Sure. When we're talking about vibrational tuning, it's a really personal process. So I don't operate on a standard framework where I take everybody through the same protocol in every session. I find that each person comes with their own challenges, their own weight, their own things that they need to work through to free themselves from the shackles, I'll say, of their own mind, right? So this is about releasing and letting our energy flow freely, unencumbered. So to do that, we have to let go of dense emotions, beliefs that are false, that are not in alignment with the truth of who we are. So a lot of what can go on when somebody sort of starts the process is just releasing some of that density, starting to recognize it. And incidentally, I find people start to feel energy. Once we start to release some of that density, a lot of people find that they're naturally clairsentient and they start to really feel it. And they're like, wow, I feel physically lighter after this session. And that's because we're truly releasing density and the body is becoming lighter.
So clairsentient is one of the 5 clairs, right?
Yeah.
Right. And you had mentioned that there were abilities that we have forgotten. Is that a reference to our true spiritual nature, or is that something else?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think humans are capable of so many wondrous things that we've forgotten how to do. And clairsentience is, I think, something that is not a gift, just like clairvoyance is another one, people who have clear sight. Some people see visions. Sometimes it's clear cognizant, which is clear knowing. So there's different kinds of clairs, but these are all things that I think are innate, natural abilities for humans. And as we become more aware of who we are, we can access these gifts. But I hesitate to call them gifts because I think it's just our normal functioning when we remember.
It seems like they're gifts because most of the mediumistic type people will say most of the time the mediums are born that way. And almost all of them remember seeing spirits from they're very young. Often it's passed down through the generations, but they also say that anyone can do it. It's just that the ability is closer to the surface in others, right?
Yeah, I believe that. I think there's plenty of people that go for all kinds of different types of training, psychic training, expansion of consciousness kinds of training for different purposes. And certainly I do think there are easier pathways for some than others. I'm very naturally clairsentient. That was the first thing I realized, is that I'm super clear feeling. So most people do have maybe a dominant gift, if you want to call it that, but I definitely think that they're all accessible and can be developed. So I don't like to think of anyone as being more gifted than another or some such thing.
So out of the 5 clairs, you are a clairsentient?
Yeah, I would say that. I think there's different things that come in at different times. Certainly, I'm quite clear knowing, which some may say is claircognizant. Certainly, sometimes clairvoyant with visions and things. But certainly, I think more than anything, clairsentience and the feeling of the vibrations is my dominant.
How is that different from an empath, or are they the same thing?
For me, they're the same thing. Actually, I've read a little bit about that, where some make a distinction in those two things. And for me, I don't look at them to be very different. I think also there's this term that's out there called a highly sensitive person. For me, that's also highly sensitive person, empath, clairsentience. They're really all tied together. Maybe there's a bit of a spectrum, but for me, they're the same thing that we're talking about.
Some people often get psychics and mediums confused. This was explained to me a while back. All mediums are psychic, but not all psychics are mediums. An intuitive can be almost like an umbrella term for several things, without having to say, I am a medium, I am this, I am that.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's why I say intuitive for myself, actually. So.
I think it's a term that we're hearing more and more. Going back to the ascension and the different dimensions, I've noticed some people talk about going right from the 3rd to the 5th. Why are they skipping over the 4th dimension?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I had one teacher that talked about the 4th as being the bardo, being a little bit of a lost place. But I think there are some shadow aspects that we have to deal with as we go through the 4th dimension. As we come into greater awareness of ourselves, to come into that 5th dimension place of unconditional love, there are aspects of ourselves that we have to meet and to integrate. And a lot of times that happens as we move through the 4th dimension and we're raising our awareness, trying to get to that unconditional love. And so I find that it's a bridge place for me. And I think it's a place where we do a lot of deep inner work.
So the 4th is not exactly a playground. It's basically a place where we have to decide whether we're going to choose service to others or service to self.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense, because I think as we move into unconditional love, that certainly is a path of service. I can't speak to all of the other choices that we could make and where they would lead, but I can certainly say as you move into the 5th dimension and unconditional love, that I would consider that to be a path of service for sure.
Right. Religious things, it's definitely one area I tread carefully in, but service to others is a common theme in church. So could it be that's one thing where the deeply religious people and the people that are not so much religious but more spiritual, is that something they have in common?
I think it is. I agree with you. That's in a number of different religions. In the East, when we talk about different types of yoga, there's karma yoga, which is also the yoga of service, right? So I think many different religions teach this path of service as being important. I think it really comes down to understanding oneness, though. Because when we talk about service to self versus service to other, at some point you understand that there is no other.
There is no other. I've never heard it explained like that, though. That's good. There's just one.
Yeah.
You have to admit, that's a really hard concept for many of us, myself included, to wrap our heads around. oneness? Because there's 7 billion of us. How can we all be one? I don't think there's really an easy way to do that, do you?
No, I think there's a really great book that came to mind when you said it's hard to understand. Rasha, Rasha, called Oneness. I think it was actually a channel document, but quite interesting look at what oneness really is. So I would think that could be a place to start, just to give people a place to begin exploring.
Your clients, what are the most common questions they have for you?
I think most people are really wondering what their purpose is. What's my purpose? What am I supposed to be doing? I think this is really out there. A lot of people are asking. That's why we have so much coaching going on. If you're on social media, you probably see this being discussed a lot. And so people really want to understand what's their deeper purpose. And I think that's a great indicator of the fact that we're starting to wake up, because people are realizing, hey, I'm going to my 9 to 5 and I don't feel like maybe this is what I was meant to do. So I really respect that folks are starting to question what is possible for their lives and what they could really contribute, because inherent in what's my purpose is what's my service. So I view that to be a really positive question.
It seems that all roads lead to that one path where if you want to go any higher or any farther, you have to choose service to others.
Yeah.
You have to give more than you take, right?
Yeah. Or I would even say just be self-sustaining. So we have to be a little bit careful of when we talk about giving more than you take, only in the sense that we don't want to get into martyrdom and the patterns of self-sacrifice. So it takes a lot of discernment to really serve from a place of unconditionality as well, so that we're not expecting any particular return, that it's really, I'll say, free from any expectation of particular outcome.
With your services and your practice, can you describe a typical scenario where someone comes in, they want to figure out what the purpose is, and if they're doing that, they're probably also thinking, how can I get to higher spiritual ground? How do they go about doing that?
I would say that we look at what are the edges for each person, meaning where do they feel really triggered in their life? Where do they come up with a lot of reaction, a lot of reactive type of emotions to different scenarios in their lives? And it could be anything. It could be job related, relationship related, family, kid. For each person, where they start their work is probably where they're having the most difficulty, though. As we're presented with these really difficult circumstances, there's always the opportunity to expand our awareness. So I feel like those challenging situations are really gifts if we look at it that way. Ultimately, the one thing that I end up going back to is really helping people to focus on being present. Ram Dass talked about Be Here Now, Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, right? So it is really about presence, because when we're present, we're free and we're operating from a place of free will. What we're trying to do is release all of the patterns of reactivity, all of those scripts of behavior that we have, that we go into autopilot. And I'll give an example. So if, say, you're married, you might have a scenario with your spouse where you know how an argument's going to start, you know how it's going to go, and the kinds of things you're going to say to each other and what buttons you're going to press, and it gets played out over and over years, unless you make a different choice in the moment. So a lot of times we're just in these reactive patterns repeating. So I help people to become aware of those patterns and to try to then make conscious responses rather than relying on those reactive patterns that perpetuate the same circumstances over and over. And that's really the work of being present. And it is work.
When you talk about being present, does your practice have a lot to do with meditation work?
It may. It depends on the person. I think meditation is beneficial for everyone. I think there are all kinds of purposes and different types of meditation, right? But I will say that visualization is a really common thing that I'll suggest to people. And a visualization is usually tailored for the specific person. But in general, I would say one that's helpful is just to think about centering the presence inside the body. Sometimes I like to do a golden light everywhere from the skin below. What we're trying to do as we sit and visualize that is we're actually trying to wake up the cells, quite literally, right? So that's a common one. But again, it could could be depending on the person and what they need in their particular circumstance.
You talk about removing certain reactive behaviors. It's almost like they're embedded tape loops.
Yes.
Of certain reactions. Does the subject of past lives ever come up?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm glad you asked that, because I was going to say that, yes, I think that we carry these same patterns with us over and over. So we could have been repeating the same pattern over so many lives. And it's not only individual patterns, but also our familial patterns, our ancestral patterns. So when we're born into a certain lineage and inherit that DNA, there may be patterns that we repeat unconsciously from our ancestors as well. Certainly, I believe in past lives, absolutely.
Let's say you're with a client and you discover certain reactive habits, behaviors, and so on. How do you know it's from a past life? And if so, do you actually bring that up with the client?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it just comes as a knowing. If it's important, then I feel like it comes to the present to be dealt with. So if it's something that they really need to know about and integrate, then we can talk about it. And as you discuss it, I find that the pattern sort of just unravels. And as we become aware of it, it actually dismantles. You don't really have to actively try to change something a lot of times. It's just bringing your awareness to it that creates the change. And certainly sometimes we can just move energy, I'll say. Like you might just feel something dense somewhere in the field and that's ready to be released, and you might release that. And maybe it was past life related and you didn't need to know. So I find both cases. Sometimes you can just let stuff go. Sometimes you need to really understand it and integrate it into your being, accept the lesson of that life, whatever it was, and then you can release and go from there.
Now, you mentioned energy fields pretty much in the same manner as a shaman would. Shamans can access those energies, and they call them foreign energies, where they're working in the field, but instead of going through a past life regression, which could be a bit traumatic, this is a gentler way, apparently, of doing it. So is there a parallel between how you access that energy and what a shaman does, or is it a lot different?
No, I think there are different ways to do the same kind of work, but I would say inherently they're the same.
They are the same. Okay.
Yes, you're working in the field of information, I'll call it.
Oh, that's the Akash, right?
Could be. Some people look at it that way.
It seems there's multiple terms for the same thing. The quantum field,
right?
The Akashic records, the universe, the energy field. Are they the same thing?
I will say out there, different people have different ideas about what these things are. Right. I certainly do just tend to look at it from a meta perspective of the universe and source energy. And then we sort of break down from there. So you've got sort of a cosmic consciousness, a universal consciousness of maybe your galaxy, Earth consciousness. There's all sorts of different levels, different fields. Certainly, Johnny, for example, you would have many multiple fields that could aggregate to be who you are, a collective consciousness of you.
It seems like we would have to have many different lives, because I don't think I can ever understand all this in one lifetime. So I'm probably going to have to come back quite a few more times. So I guess I'm looking forward to that. In reference to the Akashic records, or whatever you want to call it, I've been told that it has every event past and the future. So future readings, glimpses into the future, does that come up in your work?
Oh, sure. Sure, it does. I don't tend to do what are maybe traditional psychic readings where I'm talking to people about every scenario of every choice in their future. I tend to really focus a little bit more on the present. But if it's relevant, then certainly we can talk about the future. And I think one thing I'll mention here too is it's not just as simple as this particular life and this particular body. I think we have parallel lives. We have parallel timelines. We have parallel universes and dimensions. So the soul of a person could be located in many different places at one time.
At one time. So I have dreams of people and places that I have physically never been, but I know I've been there. And these women that I dream about, I know them somehow, even though they're not in my life here, living in South Florida or Los Angeles or wherever. Is that a way to possibly explain how those people in those places seem familiar?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It could be a parallel life. It could be a different dimension. And certainly when we sleep, there's a lot going on. We do a lot of work in our sleep. And we detach from the body often and actually go places and do things, right? So yeah, certainly I think that's definitely a possibility.
Incredibly fascinating. And since you mentioned we do work in our sleep, we go places, is that a reference to astral projection?
I think some do, certainly. But yes, I think there's many different options in terms of how you could explain what happens in sleep. But I think that our consciousness is much more free when we're in that state to go and do as it will.
And the astral world, again, is probably just another word for all these different things that we're talking about, the energy field and so on. I interviewed someone recently talking about astral projection, and the question was, what can I find in the astral world? And the response was, it's actually more of a question of what can't you find?
Yeah.
So then we start talking about different beings, different worlds. You mentioned other galaxies. Does that type of thing come up in your work, or is that pretty much still in the periphery?
No, I think that definitely comes up. We can certainly have influences and even allies that are far outside of our conscious scope.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Certainly. And I've trained in angelic healing. And so I'm quite aware that there are beings in other dimensions and other places and things that maybe the human conscious mind can't quite wrap our head around, right? But certainly you can feel the energies and you can understand the positive intentions or not so positive intentions and make your choices as to what you want to engage with or not. There's certainly a lot out there.
There's no question there's a lot out there that we're not going to get the answers right away. That's why I made the remark earlier. I'm glad that we have multiple lives, because it's going to take another dozen at least to understand all this. Right?
Fair enough.
I wanted to ask, the stuff that we're talking about, a lot of it is a bit out there. Even for open-minded people, I consider myself an open-minded skeptic, but do you ever feel the need to explain to people that don't believe in any of this? Or is that a complete waste of time?
No, I really don't. I think the only place where there's a little bit of back and forth about that, I teach yoga and Tai Chi. And so when I teach Tai Chi, there's a lot of information that's more esoteric about the energy field and what you're actually doing with energy. And this gets a little bit more into the Qigong aspect of it. But that's the only place where I'm like, okay, well, how far out do I go with these folks, right? But other than that, no, I don't try to convince anybody of anything. That's not my gig at all. I think we're matched up with people that we can learn from and that can learn from us.
That's what I thought. The reason I bring that up, someone I talked to not too long ago, we're talking about ascension and third to the fourth to the fifth. And her idea was, we got to get everybody on the boat. Whereas other people would say, no, that's not our job. They are where they are. And if we interfere, we might actually be doing more harm than good.
Yeah, that's a good opening to talk about something a little bit tricky, because we always need to be thinking about our intention for helping. A lot of times when we feel like we want to go in and help someone and save them, we're making a judgment about where they are on their path, and that we somehow know better than they do about where they need to be. It's a little bit tricky to think that you know how somebody else needs to behave and what their path is and whatnot. And I think it really comes down to respecting the equality of each being and understanding that everybody has a responsibility for their own journey. So you can put on offer your services and your wisdom, and people can show up and take advantage of that. But I think going out and actively trying to convert from a place of trying to help others that you think are lost it's a judgment.
That's a really good way to explain it. I feel like doing that sometimes, where I think this person could be in a much better place if she didn't spend 90% of her time on Instagram, which I think is pretty much a waste of time. I think if she did more of her like spiritual push-ups, as it were, she could be in a different place, which is where I think she does want to end up. But what you're saying is that me making that observation and actually verbalizing it would be a judgment, and that's really not for me to do. So we've talked about ascension. We've talked about waking up and 3D to 5D and the path, and we've acknowledged past lives. It makes a lot of sense that a lot of our behavior patterns are inherited from ancestors and past lives. So where do you think we go in between the lives?
Yeah, there are different theories of this. I think there are many different realms that are options. So in the East, sometimes they say that we exit out the crown chakra, the top of our head, right? And what we're thinking at the moment of death is what defines where we go during that sort of in-between period. I don't know that I have a good answer for you on that because I haven't consciously gone through the death process that I remember, right? But what I will say is that I think in future, humans have the ability to overcome death and at some point to consciously and willfully decide whether or not to incarnate and when to leave the body. I just want to bring that up because I think it's coming. It's a future capability that's coming online.
Is that next spring or?
I don't know about that.
I'm kidding.
But it's really the immortality. It's the understanding that we're eternal and that you can take a body when you want and you can leave a body when you want. So eventually I think that will be true.
It sounds like something you would see on the old version of Star Trek, which I think is really cool. Do you have like a guess when in the future, approximately?
No.
3,000, 4,000?
I sure don't.
So the planet's still here, in other words, as far as you know. As far as I
know.
When you say that we can overcome death, does that mean, let's say this is year 3,000 and I decide my job's done. I've done everything I can. There's a way where I can just leave the body.
You just dematerialize.
Dematerialize.
Yes.
And that's obviously at that point, we are in a much higher dimension where those kind of events or transactions are fairly commonplace. It's like someone walking to the elevator, right?
Right.
Why can't we do it now?
Have you talked to people? I'm wondering, anybody you've talked to in the course of doing this show or otherwise who's talked about seeing angels manifest here in the third dimension? I think it's exactly that capability that we're talking about.
I've not, but that's a really good point. I don't know whether you have any experience with that, but if you do, I'd like to hear about it. And
no, not for me, not visually actually seeing. I do know other people that have had those types of experiences.
They actually manifest themselves.
Yes, like an angel would manifest, and you can see with your physical eyes. And what's a little bit tricky about that, so my understanding of that is the energy has to be slowed down. So if you're thinking about an angelic being who's vibrating at a very, very high, very fast rate, what that being has to be able to do is slow the energy down to the point that it can come into the visible spectrum of the human eye. So I think it takes a lot of effort on their part, but I think this is the same concept of materializing and dematerializing. It's a choice.
Now that you mention it, there is an upcoming episode. I believe it's number 21 or 22. Down the River of Time with Doug Lawrence. He has a vision of a being. I'm not going to go into the details, but it's a pretty heavy experience. And I don't know whether it was an angel. It wasn't anything bad. So I guess, is that an angel or a guardian, a spirit guide?
Could be.
Right.
Yeah.
So it could be one of the two, but those two entities often get confused. But I've been told that guardian angels and spirit guides can be the same thing, but not all the time.
Right. I agree with that.
Yeah. I was basically caught flat-footed just listening to it because I wasn't prepared for it. He was going to talk about a past life regression with a client of his. Really interesting story. He was mentoring the client as part of his business, but the woman said, well, to really understand my business, why don't you try past life regression? And he discovered 3 lives. And in addition to that, he had that experience one night at his house. The part of talking with people on the show, which is really cool, is that these are things we can't explain, but maybe we're not supposed to know everything about it anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I totally agree. But I actually really appreciate your work because I listened to one of your other episodes and somebody mentioned that they went to their day job for so many years and, kind of had to hide this aspect of themselves because it seemed too weird for the mainstream, right? So I like it that we can have sort of intelligent, educated, seemingly neuronormal kind of people here talking about these experiences and these concepts because it doesn't need to be weird. It doesn't need to be woo-woo. And it is a lot more commonplace. Once you get people to open up and start talking about it, it's a lot more commonplace than any of us thinks it is,
It is. And I think the near-death experiences are probably the most accessible to certain people, because many people either know someone who's had the experience or they know of someone who has. They can get their head wrapped around that because there's been hundreds of thousands, or maybe it's millions, but one that was, I think, critically important was that of Eben Alexander, Map of Heaven, Proof of Heaven. He had experiences and these visions when he had no brainwaves. I don't care who you are, how smart you are, you can't explain that, because if there's no brainwaves, there's no activity. You're dead. But the other things we're talking about, seeing into the future and the Akashic records, which is supposedly like opening a book. It's got every event past, present, and future, or astral traveling, astral projection. That's a little bit more out there, but I think there's enough people that are curious about it because they understand there's an awful lot that we don't know about.
No, absolutely. And that's why I think this work is so great. And there's one question I really want to ask you. It's about the name of your show.
Oh, my.
Closer to Venus.
I was afraid you were going to do that. I'm joking.
I listened to some of your other ones previously to see if you talked about it. And I feel like you called me in with this. You called me in with the name.
I don't talk about it because I don't want to talk about myself. I'm not the focal point. The work is. But since you asked, the name Closer to Venus was the name of a synth pop group that I played in years ago. My friends had this band. It was all keyboards and it's really synthy. It's really cool. But their name was not appropriate. And I said, your name makes it sound like you're a funk jazz group, which they were not. So I said, I've had this name forever. And I think it's really cool. And we used it for like 3 weeks. Then the band dissolved. But I've kept it ever since. I didn't know what I was going to use it for. And when I started the cast, a friend of mine said, that's perfect. She explained it just like this. Mars is the god of war. Venus is the goddess of love. War has gotten us nowhere. It's in this endless cycle. And if we're going to really grow as people, grow spiritually, then love is the answer. I thought, God, you're smart. Why couldn't I think of that? I don't even remember where I found it, but anyway, that actually works because when we talk about the ascension and moving from the male energy to the feminine energy, again, it makes a lot more sense.
Absolutely. And I feel like as we talk about, it's really common to hear that we're moving into this period of the divine feminine. And this is really a heart-centered age. And I think it's so true that compassion and love is actually where we're trying to get to.
And you know what? It seems so simple, but my feeling is there's certain people that are just never going to get it. Some people will, but a lot of them are just, they are where they are. They're going to go where they're going to go. I know where I want to go. So
that's right.
And on that note, so can you give us like a quick start guide of how do we wake up?
Yeah, become present. So every action that you're doing, pay attention to your breath, and whether you're washing the dishes, whether you're brushing your teeth, try to do it with full awareness. And something that helps is to do one task at a time. It's great to multitask. I think there's a lot of pride about that and efficiency and all of this. But as we do one action at a time with intention, we become more present. And as we become more present, we become free of those habitual patterns and we can actually make a choice rather than reacting. So that's the main thing. Just become present and pay attention.
Lesson for today, folks, and for me too. That's all of us. Orianna, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Really great information. How do our listeners find you online?
I have a website. It's aleerie.com, ALEERIE.com.
Excellent. I will put that in the show notes. You've been listening to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing. If you really liked it, you can also leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.